Well, welcome everybody. And in this particular session, we're going to get down to some basics and some nuts and bolts about writing behavioral objectives. This is probably not one of the most exciting areas that you're going to listen to over the course of any seminars that we do in the center. But it is a nuts and bolts, and it is a back to basics type of approach. Writing behavioral objectives and doing it properly is a very good thing. It helps to drive and to steer your teaching. And it really can align what you're doing and kind of help to focus you in a bit. One of the things that we see is many accrediting bodies require all kinds of different objectives, program objectives, course level objectives, behavioral objectives, and they want to see these things. But the problem that we see over any period of time is people write wonderful objectives, but then those objectives don't really have anything to do with their teaching. So what we want to do today is to begin the process of how you write behavioral objectives with the idea of what we call operationalizing them, where you take those and actually have those drive your teaching and your assessments. We're going to talk a little bit about how those all fit into play and how behavioral objectives fit in with other types of objectives that we utilize throughout the programs. So, where do objectives fit within the instructional design process? When you look at sitting down and writing curriculum, this is one of the first areas and the first steps of things that we do. We have to establish a series of objectives. We have to understand many, many different types of objectives. The first thing is we look at overall program level objectives. So, what are our programs offering? And the program goals and objectives, if you really look at it, these are the knowledge and skills that any program, any of the degrees that we offer, provide our students. So when a student leaves our program, what generalized type of goals or what generalized types of knowledge and skills and abilities are they walking away with? Now, those are very, very broad brush, and they cover the entire program. So if you look across campus in any of our programs, there are program goals. Go to the website. You'll see those on any one of our degrees. And this helps students to understand, also helps us to understand what's the purpose? What are we doing with this degree? Who should be coming to it? It's aligning that with stakeholders' needs. Next, we talk about course level objectives. Now, course level objectives are what we put into any course that we're teaching. In other words, it's very, very specific to that course. They should and need to align with the overall program goals, but the course level objectives are very, very specific to that course and become part of the overall. Now, course level objectives are not going to hit every one of our program level objectives. A different course will hit certain objectives within the overall program. So the course level objectives are important because they now start to focus in a little bit more on what it is that we're looking to do. The next level that we have are what we call behavioral objectives. And these get down to the nitty-gritty of different lessons within each of our courses. So in other words, you start to see that there's a kind of a hierarchy or a pyramid or a reverse pyramid structure of where we're heading, where we're taking some things. The behavioral objectives are really very, very important because they tell us what we're going to teach, or they help to guide and drive us to what we're going to teach in any given lesson that we are offering our students. Now, those behavioral objectives are important in the sense that they help drive our instructional strategies or our pedagogies. So based upon what it is that we wish our students to be like or wish to accomplish when they leave any particular lesson, that can drive and help us to decide what type of instructional strategies we apply, whether that be a lecture, whether that be some type of group work, whether it be a project of sorts, whether it be just a simple classroom activity, whether it be different assignments that we do. These are all designed to do the exact same thing. Now, the instructional strategies and the pedagogies then lead us to assessments. Our assessments come in the form of formative and summative assessments. Now, the formative happens during the teaching. So this is where we observe students, and this is where we utilize questioning techniques to understand whether our students are learning the information. And then there's the summative assessment, which are our end of course or end of lesson type objectives, where we give assignments or tests or quizzes or whatever else. Now, those assessments are really quite interesting because as we develop our behavioral objectives, we can actually do two things. You can then, from the behavioral objectives, develop your instructional strategies or the pedagogies or your lesson plans, if you will. But at the same time, you can also design your assessments. In fact, you can actually design your assessments before you actually figure out how you're going to teach it. And that's because everything relates back to those behavioral objectives. They become the cornerstone of any lesson and anything that you have. So as those assessments are used, the assessments then help us to know, did we meet our behavioral objectives? Did we meet the objectives for that particular lesson or a series of lessons? And we do that a lot as final projects or final exams to tell us, did we meet the course level objectives as well? So those objectives you see become the cornerstone of everything that we do as far as teaching and assessment goes, and become our outcomes, which you hear a lot about the outcomes that we do, but those outcomes are driven by our behavioral objectives. So that's how these fit within the whole scheme of things. Caesar, you had your hand up. Question.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. Just a quick question, because what I am used to is what we call learning objective. So I design my courses using the learning objective. This is what my students need to get. To be honest with you, this is the first time I hear behavioral objective. For me, behavioral objective have to do with behavior. So if you help me to understand the connection between the two concepts.
They're basically the same thing. Behavioral objectives and learning objectives, they're really, think of it this way, they're what you want the student to be like at the end of a particular lesson or a particular course. Your learning objectives, or some people call them learning outcomes, can be basically the same thing. The behavioral objective format is just how we word them, how we lay them out, how we structure them. They're basically the same thing. I think in many respects, behavioral objectives are basically more specific to what it is that we're looking to do. Okay. They work towards the end goal of what you think of it this way. It's what we want the students to be able to know and to do once they leave our course or leave a particular lesson. So that's the basic difference between learning objectives or learning outcomes and behavioral objectives. I think behavioral objectives, just the way we're going to show it, can be a little bit more specific with this. So we're going to talk a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy. Alicia, question?
Yes, and I'm late because you've already changed the slide, but I love the last slide you had up, Rick. And my question is, with the arrows, the curved arrows that you had, would it be possible to also have an arrow coming up from assessments and into instructional strategies, because your assessments kind of drives maybe potential changes in your strategies as you move along if you're doing formative?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you can from that basic, because those behavioral objectives, if you notice, this is an entire circular process and there's arrows going everywhere. So everything is related. You know, the behavioral objectives relate to the instructional strategies, and the instructional strategies lead to the assessments, and the assessments lead back to the behavioral objectives. But everything, I could have arrows connecting everything. But you're absolutely correct, because after a particular lesson, those assessments tell us, did we meet our behavioral objectives? And if we did, great. And then we have to reflect on why and how we met them. If, however, we didn't meet certain behavioral objectives, then it behooves us to go back in and look at our instructional strategy and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work? And this becomes part of not only formative assessment on the part of us looking at our students, but looking at us and our teaching. This is a constant reflection. After every lesson, and I'll be honest with you, after I do this lecture, at the end of this, I'll sit back for a few minutes and look at what worked, what didn't work, and utilize some formative assessment, and over the next period of time, figure out what I need to change within this and what had impact and what didn't. We do the exact same thing with any course you teach. You look at what strategies worked, what strategies didn't work. And we get that through an awful lot of data, not only just how our students do on our assessments, but what the students report, our observations, just a tremendous amount of information that comes back at us. And the effective instructor will look at how I met those. Did I meet those objectives? And what were the good things that I did? And what were some of the things that I need to change? So you use as much feedback and information as you possibly can. I mean, there's certain things you can walk away from every lesson. You go, hey, that really went well. Or you go, okay, I don't think they got it quite as well. So maybe the next time I have to change or do something different so that I'm sure I meet those objectives. So does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it's great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about Bloom's taxonomy. Now, Benjamin Bloom first developed Bloom's taxonomy back in 1956, and he started off with the cognitive domain. Now, the cognitive domain is dealing with basically knowledge and skills and concepts. Later in the 60s, early in the 60s, he came up with the psychomotor domain, which is skills, and then worked later in the 60s to the affective domain and realized that there were 3 domains of learning. The first, the cognitive domain, are objectives that really emphasize simple recall of concepts to complex synthesis and basically the creation of new ideas and application of those concepts. Okay, sounds really, it's just basically knowledge. When you come down to it, it's knowledge that you're dealing with. The psychomotor domain is dealing with skills. Okay, and if you think about it, these are the objectives that emphasize manipulation and or control of objectives, principally through motor control. But I also believe that there's mental as well as physical skills. If you think about any one of your disciplines, there are certain things that are physical skills that fall into place. In nursing, for example, you've got students that have to do physical skills, starting IVs, doing injections, learning how to do bandages, and any one of a number of other physical skills, defibrillation, heart monitors, blah, blah, blah. But there are also what I consider to be mental skills. And I think things like statistics, math, engineering, certain aspects of planning and things, those require mental skills. I will tell you accounting is, in my mind, mental skills. It's moving numbers through a series of books. Yes, there's some physical movement, but it's minimal. So you've got a series of mental and physical skills that kind of apply. The last domain that Bloom came up with was the affective domain. And these are objectives that emphasize emotional feelings and different attitudes and allow the student to internalize and basically apply the knowledges and skills that we want. So we can teach people things. And think about this. How many times have you yourself learned something, spit it out on a test, only to forget it later because you really had no idea where it applied or what value it had? So the affective domain is something that we need to deal with and help our students to understand why what they're learning is important and where it's going to go and why we need to have it. Okay, so those are the 3 key areas. And if you look at these, each one of these get broken down into a different series, if you would. And we're going to go through and explain these. So the cognitive has some different hierarchies to it. The psychomotor has different levels to it, as well as the affective domain. So let's take a couple of minutes and talk about each of those. So first, let's take a look at the cognitive domain. Cognitive domain starts off with knowledge, then moves to comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. These are the 6 key areas that fall within Bloom's cognitive domain. Now, the knowledge area is really dealing with the simple rote memorization of information. It's working through immediate recall. Okay, so it's basically a lower level function, if you would. The next level is the comprehension of term, which is the ability to understand the meaning behind the information. Okay, so knowledge might be something as simple as being able to define a term. Okay, definitions of different things, understanding what certain terms mean. But the comprehension is the ability to understand the meaning behind those. So it's getting a little deeper, a little bit more involved. The next level is the application level, which is very simply just classroom information and how it's applied in real life situations and see where those applications of things fit. So these are hierarchy and move forward. Then you move into the higher order thinking skills, which are the analysis, the synthesis, and the evaluation. What's the difference between analysis and synthesis? Anybody? When you analyze something, what are you doing?
Taking it apart.
That's right. You're taking something that is whole and breaking it down into its individual parts. I'll give you an example. Everybody right now on a piece of paper in front of you, draw a house, just your basic house. Okay, real simple. You just do nothing great, no great artwork, just draw your basic stick figure house. Now, you've got that house. And what I want you to do is very, very quickly take a look at that house or think of your own home. What goes into making that house? List out all the things that go into making a house. We can just list that out very quickly now. What goes into making a house? Give me one item.
Roof.
Roof, okay?
Concrete blocks.
Concrete blocks.
Wood.
Wood. What else?
Oh, furniture.
Furniture. You've got glass. You've got plaster. You've got wiring. You've got copper. You've got pipes. You've got brick and
Utilities.
mortar, utilities, and everything else that goes in. We could go on and on and on. And you could end up with this very long list of things that go into building a house. That is analysis. We just analyzed a home. Now, take that list that we have. What else can you make with that list? What else can you make with brick and mortar and furniture and utilities and all that? What else could you make with that? You could build a church. You could build a school. You could build a hospital. You could build a shopping mall. You could build any one of a number of other things that you would think about. That is synthesis. So analysis is taking a whole and breaking it down into its parts. Synthesis are taking those parts and building something anew. So that is part of the higher order thinking that goes within the cognitive domain. Then you have the evaluation, which is just simply the ability to make judgments about specific criteria against what has been learned. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, what you've got is you've got what we call higher order and lower order thinking skills. And it's not that higher order thinking skills are better or more important. You have to have lower order thinking. People have to have the basic understanding, the knowledge, the comprehension, the application that goes with it in order to apply those things and do the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So it's not one's more important, it's just different levels. You can't have analysis, synthesis, and evaluation if people don't understand the basic concepts. So when we write objectives and we set our lessons in place, we have to start with the basics or the lower order thinking skills before we can move to the higher order thinking skills. So let's take a look at something else here. In 1956, Bloom put this together, his basic cognitive domain. In 2001, there was a conclave of educators that happened, and they got together and decided that Bloom's taxonomy was very, very important to the educational process, which it is, but they had a conclave to say, okay, does this need to be updated and does it need to be changed around? What they did in just basic form is they changed it around a little bit, but if you look at it, they just moved from the 1956 version of knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, and they flipped those around from nouns and they utilized the verb forms of things. So now it's just what we talked about before. It's how people remember things. It's how they understand, apply, how they analyze. And basically what they did is they thought that the synthesis aspect of things, which they said is creation, was more important. So they flipped it around, was the end goal to move that into creation, and that the evaluation was still important, but it was less important than the other. Whichever you choose to use is fine. They're not that drastically different. I have a tendency to stay with the original because that's what I'm comfortable with. Whatever you are is fine. The bottom line is, how do you apply this and how do you utilize this to help you develop and understand the teaching process through each of these domains? Again, these still fall under higher order and lower order thinking skills here. And you want to make sure that you have a mixture of both, no matter which one of these you use. Some people will prefer the 2001 because it puts it into verbiage form right away. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we kind of go through. So let's talk a little bit about the psychomotor domain, which is a little different, because with the cognitive domain, you can have a mixture of each one of these levels in here. But the psychomotor domain is a little different. It is skills, and you are looking to develop those skills to their highest level. So the goals are a little different under the psychomotor domain than on the cognitive domain. There are certain objectives within the cognitive domain that fit and others don't. So it's not like you have to have every one of those in every objective. But here in the psychomotor domain, our goal is to get people to have developed the greatest level or the highest level of skill as we possibly can. And it starts off with the ability to imitate. Then we are able to manipulate certain things. Then we get to a level of precision in developing a skill. Remember, we're talking about physical and mental skills. And then with the idea that they develop a certain level of precision and they're able to articulate and put different aspects of the skills together, ultimately to the idea that they become naturalized. Let me put this into perspective. Think back when anybody here ever teach anybody to drive? Yeah, most of us have probably taught our kids to drive. I remember teaching both my son and my daughter, and I remember coming back from the first time with my daughter in the car when we first went out on the road, and she had her permit, and we came back and my wife said to me, she said, "Well, how did it go?" And I said, "Well, it went pretty well." I said, "But I don't think we need to, we don't have to go to church this Sunday because we saw Jesus about 2-3 times. My daughter hates that story, but it really kind of fits. What happens is this: when somebody gets behind the wheel, they're not very good, but they have a basic understanding because they're imitating what they've seen. My daughter was in the car with me all of her life. For the first 16 years of her life, she was in the car and was imitating what she saw me doing as far as driving and turn signal and everything else. So it's the first level, that is just simple imitation. When we came back from the first session, she began to manipulate and put different things together. And if you think about it, there's a precision and an articulation that happens where you're putting certain aspects of the skills together. Braking and gassing and steering and turn signaling, it's all becomes this beautiful array of things, this ballet of putting stuff together to make the car go where you want to and get there safely. Now, ultimately, what you're looking to do is get to a naturalization. Now, that naturalization is quite unique in the sense, think about this. How many of you drove into the office today, or will drive, or yesterday drove home from work or from someplace else? When you do that, did you think about everything that you did? I mean, how many of you get home from work at the end of the day and go, okay, I got home and I drove, but do you know if you used your turn signal or did you think about turning the wheel? You didn't. It was all naturalized to the point you get in the car, you just automatically do certain things. That's naturalization. Now, I believe, in fact, when I saw my daughter go for her driver's test, she was good, but she wasn't naturalized. I think she was at a level of precision and articulation and putting the skills together and being able to do certain things. But it wasn't until about 3-4 months later, after she was on her own driving, and I got in the car with her and realized she was very good and she had become naturalized to the driving process. This is the same thing with every skill that we teach. We have a hierarchy that we start with the students imitating the first time. First time the students do things in a chemistry class, they light a Bunsen burner. Okay, they're just imitating what they've seen the instructor do. And so it goes on, and they just become better and better and better at whatever skills that they're doing, utilizing a microscope and focusing things. It's all skill development. So the psychomotor domain is important, but again, the affective domain is something altogether different again. The psychomotor domain is very hierarchical to a goal. The cognitive domain works with the idea of breaking down different pieces of knowledge to ultimately be able to apply it. And so we have different objectives that we want to accomplish, certain things we want students to be able to define or clearly articulate how they're going to apply it, ultimately to getting them to apply certain concepts. But the affective domain really kind of pulls things all together. If we don't address the affective domain, then students don't understand why they're learning things or where it's going to fit. So we have to focus in on this. The problem with the affective domain is it's more nebulous. It's more difficult to measure. And there are things that we're doing within that affective domain that we want to get students to understand. We want them to first receive information and understand why this is of value. And we want them responding, and we want them seeing the value of what they're doing. So we need to build things in with this that show the students why what they're learning is of great value. And this is important within the total scheme of things. So let's take a look at the receiving aspect of things. When students receive, this is the component of the affective domain that is most basic and really involves kind of an awareness that this is of value to them. The next thing that we do is we work with the response terms. This area involves the willingness of the students to participate actively in the learning process. So again, if they don't see, I want to say the value of it, which is a word we're using in this that Bloom uses, but if they don't see the value of it, they're not going to retain it. They're not going to understand it or want to learn it and want to internalize it. So we're giving them reasons and showing them why what they're learning is of value. Go back to the concept of anatomy and physiology, which Ashley teaches. Ashley, you still teach A&P, correct?
No, it was foundations that you observed in. Yeah.
Still
Which there was some A&P in it, yes.
There was some, that's why I remember that. But any kind of anatomy and physiology class, in fact, any one of our disciplines has what we consider to be foundational type courses or basic courses. An anatomy and physiology course in many healthcare programs, nursing included, becomes kind of that type of foundational course with a lot of rote memorization of, you know, the body parts, the muscles, the nerves, the blood vessels, the bones, all of that, you know, all the organs. There's a lot of anatomy here that they're having to memorize. The problem with teaching a course like that is, how does this apply? Why do I need to learn this? Okay, I'm memorizing all this stuff, but I don't actually know where it's going to. In the broad scope of things, yeah, I kind of understand. If I'm going to be a nurse or I'm going to be a doctor in healthcare, I have to understand the anatomy. But why I need to understand every aspect of this doesn't always present itself in the initial part when you're teaching it. And this is why the instructor has to be so focused on helping the student to see what value they're going to be. In other words, where are they going to use this information in the future? If the student doesn't see that and doesn't understand that, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to internalize that, to process it, to internalize it, and to make it part of them for the future. So those are things to consider as we go through. All right, so let's talk about the foundation of any lesson plan, which is the behavioral objective and what it does. It does several things. Any behavioral objective tells the instructor what he is planning. In other words, it is the driving force behind it. And this has been part of a problem. I've seen too many of us that write wonderful objectives, but then they really don't have anything to do. In other words, we don't really utilize them in our teaching. So if you write them well, they really can structure and tell you as the instructor what you're planning for. It's kind of like those of us who do research. You know, we write hypotheses or we write research questions. Those become the guiding principles for what we're going to carry forward within our research. Same thing for any kind of a lesson that we're going to teach. The behavioral objective is the foundation for that. It also helps in the completion of the rest of the plan because a well-crafted objective just logically tells you how you can teach this. Or certain things need to be lectured, certain things need to be, the students need to do it. They need to see it planned for them, or they need to see it executed. If I'm going to teach a skill, they need to see it first so they know how to imitate it. I mean, think about math teachers. You're teaching math. Math, in many respects, there's a lot of cognitive domain there, but there's also a lot of psychomotor. So what do we do initially? If I'm teaching how to conduct a math problem or how to do something or how to solve a quadratic equation, I first put a problem up on the board and then I solve it and go through the steps and procedures for it. This is something that falls out, and I know logically if the student is going to be able to demonstrate the proper steps and procedures for solving a quadratic equation, I know I first have to demonstrate that for them. So it does help in the completion of the rest of the plan and basically tells the student what is expected of it. So what this then tells me is I need to convey these behavioral objectives to the student. So they do two things. They tell the instructor what's going to happen, and they tell the student what they're planning, what's going to be learned. This means that they need to be incorporated either on a lesson plan or some type of form you hand your students where you can put it on your Blackboard shelf for particular lessons, whether it's a fully online lesson or whether it's one that you're doing a fully face-to-face course. You can still put your objectives up, and then the students see what they're planning, what you're planning for them to learn. So it's communication for everybody if it's done properly. Caesar, question.
Thank you, Richard. One of the issues that we sometimes face in engineering in particular, Richard, is that the students want to memorize the process instead of understanding how they can apply that concept to any problem. So they try to memorize the steps, and they think that the step applies to everything. So my question to you is, how can we design this type of objective to try to solve that problem? Because I don't want my students to memorize the process. I want them to understand how they can apply the process to anything.
Correct. I think what you do with this is if you put your objectives down, that they're going to fit within certain cognitive, in other words, that they understand the process or they're able to define the process. But then when you get to a psychomotor objective, there's when you cross those objectives. And this is important, especially in engineering, because you've got cognitive domain, you've got knowledge that the students have to know and a certain level of memorization. But then you have a lot of psychomotor domain where they're going to take those concepts and apply them. So I think what happens is you provide an understanding what the issue is where students are going to try and shortcut everything. That's just an automatic human nature. So what you're doing is in order to help them to, analyze and basically synthesize and evaluate, which are the higher order thinking skills, as well as being able to be naturalized in those processes. Those are your objectives, but how you operationalize those and the activities that you give them will help. In other words, you can cross a lot of different domains. Sorry, my slides are jumping. You can cross a lot of different domains, and then through your activities and your instructional strategies, you utilize those different areas. In other words, you put forward different instructional strategies that will show them just the memorization is not the end game, but then different applications of that through activities. And as Dr. Tomei put, as Larry put in the chat, in order, and we'll get to that here in a few minutes, when you put your action verbs down or your measurable terms, which we'll talk about, that will help to define what you do and help you to see your students' needs within that. Okay, so we'll get there in just about a second or two. So a well-crafted objective does 5 things. Okay, a lot of the literature deals with 3 activities here, but we've put a couple of additional things in place. 1, it has to be written for the student. You can't write an objective that talks about instructional strategies or things that you as the teacher are going to do. You have to write it for the student. And so a lot of what you do is you will start off with, at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to. So that puts it into behavioral terms right away and takes it out of the fact that, the instructor will give a lecture. That's not an objective. That's an instructional strategy. You want to stay away from what you're going to do, and you want to look first at what is the student going to be able to do at the end of the lesson. You're not dealing with yet how you're going to get them there. You just want to figure what is the student going to be able to do. So first off, write it for the student. Second, they have to be measurable. And I would tell you, you need to use measurable terms. A term like, and this is very controversial within education, and this conclave of educators changed this, but the word understand. You have to use a measurable term. Can you measure somebody's understanding? Not really. I mean, if you want, that's what we want them to be able to do, but we have to put it in measurable terms. So if I want them to understand, and this goes back to Caesar's comment and question, and part of this can be the higher order thinking in the cognitive domain, but also crosses into the affective domain. I want the students to be able to demonstrate something, or I want them to be able to describe, or I want them to be able to analyze different problems and different situations. So that becomes part of your goal. And when you use action words like that, Caesar, then, and like everybody else, then you can design your lessons accordingly. So they have to be measurable. They need to be clearly stated and specific to be usable. I've seen some wonderful objectives, but they're too vague. You need to be specific as possible, and sometimes more objectives is better than one vague objective where you break it down. They need to include what we call conditions of performance. In other words, this is what you're going to give the student or withhold from the student. So think about this a second. If I want a student to be able to solve something, is there a different skill set if I have them do it with a calculator or without a calculator? If I want the student to solve a problem with, I want them to solve a quadratic equation, and if I give them a calculator, that's a different skill set or a different outcome than if I don't give them one. So we have to think through what we're going to do and what we have to give them. And this is not, given a lecture, the student will be able to define quadratic equation. That's not what we're looking for. That's an instructional strategy. What I want to know is, what do you have to give them? Okay, I have to give them an example. I have to give them a problem. I have to give them a setting. Given a quadratic equation or given an example, a student will be able to. So those are things that you're giving them or withholding from them. Okay, and given or withholding, the condition of the performance can also define the outcome. Sorry, keeps jumping on me. The fifth thing is you have to state standards of acceptable performance. This is how well the student has to be able to do something. And these fall out within the confines of time, quantity, and quality. Now, not every objective will have this clearly articulated, but it will be there. Example, if I want the student to be able to define quadratic equation, I might come up with, at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to define a quadratic equation. Do I have to say with 100% accuracy, or do I have to say, well, I want them to be able to define the quadratic equation with 50% accuracy? No, I think it's assumed in that objective that we want it done. But when we start about standards of acceptable performance, we're talking time, quantity, and quality. Let me give you an example. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to type 40 words per minute with 3 or less errors in 5 minutes. Okay, that is time, quantity, and quality. It defines how well somebody has to do something. Not every objective will have all 3 of those, but you want it with a certain level of quality. And we'll kind of show you some examples here. So let's get to the objective writing rules, and they have to be written for the student. Basically, objectives should describe student behavior, not instructor behavior or activity. You want to be careful with that. So at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to, and I start all of my objectives. In fact, at the objective section, I just put TSWBAT at the beginning and use that as the prefix for every sentence. And after that, everything just falls right in line. If you start out with, at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to, everything just falls in line, and your wording focuses then on student behavior. The wrong aspect is the instructor will give the students a lecture, or the instructor will give the students a list. That's instructor behavior. We're not looking at instructor behavior, we're looking for student behavior. So think what you want the student to be like at the end. Next, we have objective writing rules. Are they measurable? Okay, use measurable terms. So you should ask yourself things like, what is the learner doing when he is demonstrating that he has achieved the objective? Okay, so an example, the statement, to develop a critical understanding of the operation of a cardiac monitor, could read as an objective at the end of the lesson. Given a monitor, that's conditions of performance, the student will be able to accurately, and that's standards of acceptable performance, that's how well, so we want them to do it accurately, identify by name each of the controls located on a life pack. Okay, and that's just a cardiac monitor. It's an old cardiac monitor, but it's still a cardiac monitor. So those are things that we can do to put that into objectives. So I want them to understand the operation of a cardiac monitor. That's the broad brush. But putting it in behavioral objective format, this now has all 5 of those concepts in place. So the objective must be written in behavioral terms. And these are some examples down here. Behavioral terms such as identify, describe, define. The student will be able to solve a quadratic equation. The student will be able to compare and contrast one problem with another problem. The student will be able to list. All of those are behavioral terms that I can measure. And sometimes those are things I can see on an exam or I can see on a project. Non-behavioral terms, things that I can't. How do you measure whether somebody is enjoying something or if they're understanding? Yes, if they're smiling, that's wonderful. They're enjoying it, but is that really learning? Is that behavior? How can you measure if somebody believes something or really understands? I used this term years ago, and I said, well, you can't use the word understand. The student came up and said, well, they'll really understand. So if we put that emphasis, it's not. Those are not measurable terms. So it's not as easy. And you can say, well, I can put them in. But the problem will be when you sit down to start articulating how you're going to use those, they may not have as great a viability for you in operationalizing those as when you keep them clean and use behavioral terms. I have a sheet that I will post up on Blackboard, and I think it's already up there once, but I'll move it around and put it under this section. And it goes through and uses a bunch of different terms that you can use, a bunch of measurable words that will help. Just the student be able to arrange, the student be able to categorize, the student, any skills, those are things that you want them to be able to do, and we'll kind of help you with those. The third area of this is, are they clearly stated and specific? This is something that we saw years ago, that we had some really great objectives that met all the criteria, but they weren't specific enough. And so I wasn't really sure what the student wanted them to do or what was needed or what the teacher was looking for. So a statement like the student will be able to define the key terms. Okay, that's nice and I understand, but what are the key terms? Well, I have them in a list over here. No, put them in your objectives. List them out. So the student will be able to accurately define asset, liabilities, and owner's equity given a balance sheet. That's more specific and clearly stated. So put down what you want. And the problem is, in certain areas you have a lot of key terms that you're using, but you can list them out. And the question is, should I have one objective for each term, or can I put them all like I did here? Just depends what you want to do and what's going to be clear. Some people are fine with having a dozen objectives, and a lot of them are definition terms. That's fine. Or you can put them all in one if you want to. That's fine too. Remember, these are for your operation and for your utilization and how you're going to drive your own teaching. So it's your choice in that respect. So they must also have conditions of performance. This is what you're going to give the student or what you're going to withhold from the student. So this is how they're going to display it and what they need to do. So you kind of have to frame things here. It helps define the conditions required in the learning experience. The conditions further define that behavior of what they're looking to do. Example that I said before was, you give them a computer or a calculator, you withhold one. Changing the condition may change the behavior. Okay, changes the outcome to a point. Sometimes, though, the condition is implied in the behavior. So, example, what the student will be given or withheld, some things to ask yourself. What will the learner be provided? What are you giving them? What will the learner be denied? Are there behaviors you are specifically trying to avoid? And in doing so, put those into your objectives. And I use the example here. Given a calculator, a student will be able to solve quadratic equations. Withholding a calculator, a student will be able to solve. So those are just two different things that you look at there. So just think of what you're doing with that, or what your end goal is. The standards of acceptable performance, again, is how well the student must perform. Okay, it is quantity, it is quality, it is time. And you will build those in as are appropriate for those. One of the things I will tell you is, be careful about the student will be able to do something to 86% accuracy. Well, where did that come from? Be careful about setting arbitrary standards. If there is something set within your program goals, if there's something set within outside standards that you're utilizing, that within nursing, maybe they have to be able to start an IV in the first time successfully 90% of the time. I don't know if that's one or not, but then that would be something to build in. But don't just arbitrarily set standards in place unless you can back them up with certain standards or certain program goals or certain outside standards that you're looking for. You want to be very careful with that as well. Okay. Okay, so summary. They have to be written for the student. They have to be measurable. They have to be clearly stated and specific to be usable. They have to include conditions of acceptable performance, what you're giving or withholding, and they have to state the standards of acceptable performance, which is time, quantity, and quality, how well they have to be able to do something. The majority of the time, I would probably tell you that we want people to be able to do something with 100% accuracy or do it accurately, and those are how you can label that. So here are some examples of objectives and some things that you can do with this. One, the student will be able to accurately define iambic pentameter given verse and verse drama examples. That's a cognitive objective. So we want them to be able to define that. Maybe another objective is I want them to be able to write poetry using iambic pentameter. That's a different objective altogether, but this one is a cognitive domain. And simply, it's a lower function. Before they're able to write it, they have to be able to define it and know what it is. Second objective example is the student will be able to demonstrate the proper steps and procedures for using a microscope, given slides, and an electric microscope with 100% accuracy. So in this objective, what's the measurable word? What's the measurable word here? Measurable word on this one is to demonstrate. The student will be able to demonstrate. That's our measurable word. So if I know how I'm going to teach that, how do I teach this? Even if you're not a science instructor, how would I teach this? This basically tells me if I have to have the student demonstrate this, then what do I have to do? I have to demonstrate this first. Then I have to give them a microscope. I have to give them slides. I have to give them an electric microscope. And I have to give them the steps and procedures, and they have to practice it, and they have to do it. So when I assess this, not only do I know how I taught it, but how do I assess this? Can I assess this by giving them a multiple choice question on the steps and procedures? No, I can't, because the objective says the measurable word is to demonstrate. So if they write it down, I don't know that they can do it. I know that they maybe understand the steps and procedures. And that goes back to Caesar's question before. You know, you put the objectives in place on what you want them to do. So I want them to be able to demonstrate. So that means the only way I know to assess that is they have to come up in front of me and demonstrate the skill. So I have to see them do it. So the objective is defining the outcomes. It's also defining how we will teach. It's defining how we will assess. The example that I used before, the student will be able to type 40 words per minute for 5 minutes with less than 3 errors given a timed typing test. So I have to give them a timed typing test. I've set the standards of acceptable performance. In this one, what is the measurable word? What's the measurable word that we're using here? It's typed. Yep, it's very simply typed. The student will be able to type. That is a measurable word that I can utilize there. It's an action verb in essence. The standards of acceptable performance are they'll have to be able to type the 40 words per minute for 5 minutes with less than 3 errors. Those are the standards of acceptable performance. It's very, very specific. It's written for the student, and it's measurable. So it has all those elements. What are the conditions of performance? What do I give the student? I have to give them a timed typing test. Obviously, I have to give them a computer, a keyboard in order to do that. So certain things are assumed, certain things are not, but you want to be as specific as possible. The last example I have is the student will be able to effectively differentiate between the reasons for the North and the South entering the Civil War. This is maybe more of an affective domain type of an objective. Some people would say that this also could be a higher order thinking skill on the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation aspect of the cognitive domain. In fact, what you see, and one of the reasons that the affective domain is so difficult is because they do cross over a little bit. And they're not quite as measurable, but effectively differentiate. In other words, this is going for a description, and you can look at that and how they're going to, and this also gives you a general idea of what they have internalized. Okay, so these are just some different examples. So what I would ask everybody to do is very quickly think of your own subject area. Okay, think of something that you're doing in your own subject area. What I'd ask you to do is write a behavioral objective or two in, I say just one in each domain. So pick one simple concept, and I want you to think of writing a behavioral objective in any one of those areas, and write one in the cognitive, write one in the psychomotor, and write one in the affective. And I'll put the summary of objective criteria back up very quickly. Let's take about a minute or two and do that, and then we'll just kind of share a couple of objectives and take a look at them. Thank you, Sylvia. So does anybody have an objective that they wish to share?
Oh, I'm still writing, but
Okay.
I started with cognitive of identify steps and sterile technique. And my psychomotor, demonstrate performance of sterile technique procedure. And then I guess my affective, that's the one I'm working on right now.
Those are more difficult.
Differentiate between sterile and non-sterile, I guess, objects within a field.
Yes. Yes. And you can work, you can put more in there about the conditions of performance and the standards, but I think you've got the idea and the concepts of that. Read your first one again. Read your cognitive objective again.
I kept it simple. Identify steps in sterile technique.
Okay. So the student will be able to identify the steps in the sterile technique. Okay. What do you have to, it's written for the student.
Mm-hmm.
It's measurable. What's your measurable word there?
Identify.
Identify. Okay. Lower order, but it still works. Okay. They have to be able to identify that, they have to be able to understand that before they can begin to apply it, before they can begin to analyze and synthesize it. It is measurable. Okay. It's clearly stated, and I think it's specific enough to be usable. Okay. Do you have conditions of performance? What are you giving them or withholding from them?
For the psychomotor?
For the cognitive?
Well, giving to them in the terms, I guess, of the lecture of how to do it successfully. So I'd have to give them that information.
So you get, read the objective again.
Identify steps in sterile technique, which I need to add more to it.
Not really.
To make it complete.
No, I think you've got you know what those steps are. Okay. So obviously you're going to have to provide them the steps, but that's kind of implied in my mind. I mean, to say, given a list of the steps and procedures, the student will be able to, you can put that in there, but that's one of those things I think is implied. Okay. There's certain conditions that are applied and certain that are not. And you as the instructor need to know when to do that. What are your standards of acceptable performance? How well do they have to be able to do that? Did you put that in?
For my psychomotor, or are we still on cognitive?
I think everybody's frozen on my screen. Oh, there we go. Ashley, what were your standards of acceptable for how well do they have to be able to do this?
For the psychomotor?
For the cognitive. For the cognitive.
Well, typically in nursing, if we were measuring something overall cumulative, we look at an 80% score. So I would have to, in that lesson, if I were doing it as a test, I would have to identify the minimal accepted standard for that.
You could.
Yeah.
You can. But with this one, I think they either do it or they don't. They either are able to identify something or they're not. They're able to list it or they're not. So again, I think certain times that becomes implied, to say with 100% accuracy, would you want somebody to be able to do it with 80% accuracy? Maybe that's the nursing standard, but I think within a teaching standard, we want them to be able to do it. They either do it or they don't do it.
And I think in nursing, that's where psychomotor comes in, because when it's a skill that has to be performed, it is basically a pass-fail.
Correct. Correct. And that's what most skills are. So read your psychomotor objective again.
Demonstrate performance of sterile technique procedure.
Okay. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to demonstrate the sterile, say it again.
Technique procedure.
Demonstrate the sterile tech procedure. What do you have to give them?
Give them, well, it goes back to the first one. So give them the steps, and as the instructor, perform it first so that they can see how to properly perform it, and then allow them the materials for hands-on practice.
Bingo. So you have to give them all of the equipment, give them the operating room equipment, give them a sterile, basically maybe you would say give them a sterile tray.
Yep.
Okay, so that would be the condition of performance. Given a sterile tray, the student will be able to demonstrate. Okay, that's how you, and the acceptable performance again is they either do it correctly or they don't. It's, correct, as you said, it's pass fail. You can put in there the student will accurately demonstrate the steps and procedures for, and that will help to do that. But again, that's implied if you want it. Anybody else have example? Those are good, Ashley. Those are very good. Anybody else have one that they want to share?
I'm still working on affective, but I could share the other ones.
Please.
So cognitive, I had identified 3 examples of CAM therapies available to manage personal well-being.
Okay, let's break it down. And you have the, at the beginning, the student will be able to, so it is written for the student. What's your measurable term there, Jess?
Identify 3.
Identify 3. It is clearly stated. Do you have conditions of performance and or standards of acceptable performance? What are your conditions of performance?
Well, I guess I had 3 examples.
Okay, so you're giving them 3 examples. That's good. And what are your standards of acceptable performance?
I was thinking implied that they would have to identify them.
They're applied that they, and they're, you're, when you say identify, that's, you can put the word accurately identify, but it's just basically the same. Or some people will put with 100% accuracy. It's implied in many respects. Unless there is an absolute need to put that in, I think you're okay with that. Okay, that's good. What was your cognitive one, or your psychomotor?
Properly demonstrate the 4-7-8 breathing technique used for relaxation.
Okay. Properly demonstrate. So what's your, it's written for the student. The student, at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to.
Yeah.
It's measurable. What's your measurable term?
Demonstrate.
Demonstrate. It's clearly stated. That's for sure. What are your conditions of performance there? What are you giving them?
Have to do it properly.
Okay. Well, to do it properly, I think, is your standard of acceptable performance. In other words, they have to do it properly, have to do it accurately. It's one of those things, they either do it right or they don't do it right.
Yeah.
And if they're not doing it right, you don't want somebody with, 80% accuracy on a skill. You want them to be able to do it. So that's 100% accuracy. So what, though, are you having to give them with this? In order to demonstrate that skill, what do they have to have in front of them?
We'll have to practice it. They'll have to demonstrate it, then they'll have to practice it, and then they'll have to.
What's the skill? What's the skill again?
The 4-7-8 breathing technique.
Okay, so they have to have somebody standing in front of them to demonstrate that, or they have to be able to do it themselves. So yeah, that's, yeah, I understand what you're saying. They could have, with a partner or with an example or with a person, they could see that. And it's not necessarily you're going to show them a video, you're going to show them an example, or you're going to demonstrate that yourself. That's a teaching technique, and that's what you know with that. So you don't have to provide them that, and that kind of goes without saying. Actually, the objective is what is going to drive and guide your structure. So take a look at your objectives. Do they tell you how to teach? If you're looking at those objectives, let's go back to the example that I put up here for a quick second. Okay, so let's take a look at the accurately define iambic pentameter given verse and verse drama examples. So what does that tell me I have to do? If I'm going to operationalize that, how would I teach that? How would I teach this? Even if we're not English teachers, how would I teach this? Well, it tells me here, and logically, if I have this accurately defined iambic pentameter given verse and verse drum examples. So this tells me I have to give them some examples. I have to throw up poetry or verbiage that illustrates iambic pentameter. So I have to show them exactly what it is. Then I need to break it down and tell them why it's iambic pentameter so that they can properly define what that is and what that means. So I have to give them certain examples. I have to give them verses like that. And then they are able to understand it. So I understand then how I have to teach this. How would I assess this? How would I assess this? Formatively, if I'm having them write iambic pentameter, maybe the next objective is not only will they be able to accurately define, the students will be able to write iambic pentameter. So maybe that's my next objective. That becomes part of the psychomotor is I want them to write it. So in order for that, then I would have to observe them do it and have to see them. But if I'm going to measure this one, accurately define iambic pentameter, what would I do? Something as simple as I could write a multiple choice question that would give them a test and say, okay, please define iambic pentameter. Or I could give them a multiple choice question with the right definition of iambic pentameter and 3 distractors and have them pick the right one. So any way I could do something like that, or I could have them simply write out the definition, however you want to do that. If I'm going to take the second one, this is a psychomotor, if I'm going to demonstrate the proper steps and procedures for using a microscope given slides and an electric microscope with 100% accuracy, how do I teach to that? And this is just a skill. How do I teach to this? Basically, what I need to do with something like this is I have to have a microscope in front of me, up in front of the room. I have to have slides. And then I need to demonstrate the proper steps and procedures. I have to show them how to do certain things. And I have to break it down and tell them what those steps are. Then I'm going to have every student with their own microscope in front of them. And they, in turn, then are going to emulate that. They're going to do those steps and procedures themselves. So this is what I'm looking to do. The student, in order for them to be able to do this skill, they have to first see it, then they have to practice it. They have to do it so that they can understand it. So this is where we are with that, and this is what you can do. So any one of your objectives, if they're written properly with the 5 elements in all 3 of those domains, cognitive, psychomotor, and affective, then ultimately you can operationalize those objectives in building your lesson plans as well as developing your assessments. So one of the things I wanted to bring to your attention was this, something to think about in kind of closing this out. This is what is called the cone of learning. Some of you have seen this, and in your teaching, as you go through this, the general rule is, and I'm not sure how much research this is based on, but it's pretty intuitive when you kind of look at it from a teaching perspective. Students remember 10% of what they read, and that's just through reading whatever text. So when you assign textbook reading, they read it, but they're only really retaining or internalizing about 10%. They remember 20% of what they hear, and that's just through listening. So when you're talking and standing in front of the room lecturing, they're only absorbing about 20%. When they're looking at visual aids, they're a little bit more involved or a little bit more processing. They can take on about 30%. So that's any PowerPoints or any kind of handouts or anything that you're using. We remember 50% of what we hear and see. So when you start combining senses together, when you watch demos and videos, students will have a tendency to learn a little bit more. We remember 70% of what we say. So participation now in discussions or oral presentations becomes a little bit more involved. And we remember 90% of what we say and do. So simulations and real life experiences start to help us. So basically, the more active we make people, the more likely they are to retain, to learn, and to internalize information. In the upper scale of things, reading and listening and looking at some things, we're a little bit more passive in our learning. But when we move down and you start to combine senses and you start to combine teaching strategies, people become more active learners. And when they're more active, we know that they're more engaged in what's going on and they have a tendency to retain and to learn more. So, questions. We've covered a lot of information in this last hour. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Caesar.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for such a bunch of concepts. The question I have for you is, one of the areas that I am really interested in is a student engagement. How can we use this objective to engage the students in the learning process?
Very good question. And this goes back to making sure that your objectives are complete and that they are well written to cover and make sure that you're covering the full scope of what is necessary. And you know this. In other words, that they align with your program objectives, they align with the course objectives. In other words, you're matching them back, and that you break it down by lesson. And then being able to properly do that, then you can break them down to make sure that you're engaging your students and they drive your instructional strategies. Those instructional strategies come from your objectives, but your objectives first have to be complete. They're not the end all of things. They're actually the beginning. They're the driving force. So if your objectives are complete and they're written well across the 3 domains, then you're more likely to develop instructional strategies that are going to meet those needs. And that is what Alicia was talking about earlier, when you kind of measure back and forth. In other words, you assess where students are, what did they learn, and did they meet your objectives to begin with? So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, or was just additional concepts.
I think it helps students be engaged too, because then they know the expectations and they're not concerned about trying to figure them out. So then they're more concerned about meeting the expectation and being engaged with the content to help them know what they need to do to be successful.
Well, I think this is, I think Jess hits on a very, very important point, and something we talked a little bit about earlier. You need to, those objectives are not just written for you, and they are. I mean, they're there to help you to drive what you teach, but you got to share those with your students. And if they understand what the objectives are, they also understand what those expectations are. And then they can work closer to achieving those expectations. And I think sometimes that's part of the problem, is students come into our classes and they really don't know what the expectations are. And then when they get assessed on something, they go, well, I didn't understand. I didn't know what was required. I didn't know what I was supposed to be. So the objectives can help to further, articulate that. Okay, it can help to define those as well. Other questions?
Well, and I was just thinking that, in response to Caesar's question, incorporating formative assessment so that students are also able to assess themselves, providing opportunities for learner formative assessment against those objectives may help with engagement as well, kind of tying things back together.
This is one of those concepts when you start teaching objectives in isolation from the full picture, it's difficult sometimes to understand what they're used for and what they mean. It's all part of the process of teaching. We're just talking about objectives today, but Alicia's right. This fits in with the total scope of first having the objectives and then deciding what are some of the best ways to teach to those objectives, and then what is the best way to assess those objectives, and then go back and look at the total picture here and find out what met students' needs, what didn't meet students' needs, what instructional strategies that I apply, and were my objectives still good? All of those kind of things just are a constant review and a constant reflection of things. But it all starts back to writing those behavioral objectives and making sure that those are in line with our course objectives and our program. It sounds complicated, and initially it may be, but after you get into it, you start to see the picture, and you start to see the bigger picture by defining those objectives first. Other comments or questions?
This would be useful in peer evaluation also, right? To include those objectives in that?
Yeah, I think so. Dennis. In what way are you talking about? But I agree.
Well, I mean, you just can't turn them loose and let them evaluate each other. You have to have a set of procedures. I think
you're talking student evaluation. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, if you're doing some kind of group work or cooperative work where you actually have students evaluate each other, if you don't set clear objectives about what it is that they're to do or clear listing of things, then you're right. They'll go off on a tangent. They'll create their own objectives or have their own outcomes looking at. This is what the objectives do. They will clearly define and they focus people in and where they need to be and what they need to be doing. So yeah, I agree with you. Writing those objectives or communicating those to students, and specifically if it's peer-to-peer review, so this is one of the things that I do. How many of you do group work or do group projects? Yep. And much of it, and there's a lot of advantage to that. We're going to probably have a seminar later this semester or beginning of next on cooperative learning techniques. But one of the biggest hassles with that is when you get into group work is, the biggest complaint you have is, well, 1 or 2 students do all the work and 2 or 3 other students don't do anything and everybody gets the same grade. We hear the same thing over and over again. One of the ways around that is what Dennis is talking about, where you have that peer review. Have everybody in the group evaluate everybody else in the group, but you have to give them the criteria. Basically what I do is give them those objectives or give them the criteria that I set that I'm going to evaluate their project. They can evaluate each other on. So you just it's all about bringing these objectives and bringing the outcomes to full view. It's expectations for the students. You tell them what you want them to do, and then you tell them how they're going to do it. So yeah, I agree with you, Dennis. It's good. Other questions?
Richard, just a question regarding online learning.
Yes, sir.
We are in this either because of COVID or because management wants to teach more courses online, whatever the reason may be, is how can we apply all these concepts to online learning, which how challenging it is to engage students.
Correct. What this does, in fact, I will tell you that we now have, and you have to look at it from the opportunity, and you're right, management has their reasons and their rationale for, putting certain things in place, and a lot of that's defined within the contract. But when you look at the objectives processes and the objectives that you develop don't change whether it's online or on ground. The program is basically the same thing. And there are many programs that we offer at the university that are both taught as an on-ground, as an online. What I think that the online does is it opens up a new set of pedagogies or a new set of instructional strategies. And I'm not saying that everything transfers. Let's face it. You've got now face-to-face, you have online asynchronous, and you have online synchronous. And what we're doing right now is online synchronous. Everybody's sitting in their own office or they're sitting in their own homes doing, whatever you're doing. But this is we're separated by space. We're in the same time, but we're separated by space. Asynchronous is where we're doing things through the LMS through Blackboard. So we're separated in space and time. So everybody's operating differently. Any one of these, in conjunction with face-to-face, asynchronous, synchronous, or any of those, they create certain challenges of things that there are certain things that I always say, Caesar, are better taught. There's some things that are better taught face-to-face. There are other things that are taught better online, and having the ability to move back and forth. I think there's some things that are better taught this way through synchronous. In other words, it gives people more abilities to collaborate. It's a different set of tools. And I think it behooves us as instructors to understand the different dynamics and what may fit better for our own. And there's not a one size fits all. I can't give you, certain parameters that say, well, no, this is going to be better taught face to face. It depends upon your objectives. It depends upon your students, depends upon you and the different skill sets of each. And so it is such a dynamic process. We're always having to assess that. But I think any of the objectives that you do, let me give you 2 examples. If you provide, and if your goal is to have them define certain things, or you have to demonstrate certain things to fulfill objectives, if you're sitting in front of them in a face-to-face, you might stand at the board, lecture and give information, and they'll take notes and do all that. And that's an in-class type thing. But if you were to transfer that online to this, you would do basically the same thing, except you might have PowerPoint, you might use a whiteboard with, you know, the Google Meets. That would be that way. But if you transfer this to an asynchronous platform where they're learning it on their own time, I might do this completely different, where I would do a narrated PowerPoint and do a demonstration that way. Or I would get on and do a Google Meets video and make a video of myself writing something or demonstrating something, and then the students would receive it in a different way. It's just a matter of thinking digitally and how your students are going to receive things and what the opportunities are in any one of those three platforms that you would cross over. And that's just something that comes with some time and experience and sharing of ideas back and forth with other instructors. And, you know, Alicia and Shannon, Nicole and myself and Jessica are all here along with Diane. We're all here to assist in any way that we can and give you different ideas and bounce different ideas off of you with that. You know, certain things that work within engineering might not work within business, might not work within education or nursing, but other things might. So it's a sharing of ideas back and forth, which is one of the things that the CIT is all about. So I don't know if I answered your question, or I just rambled on for a while. I have a tendency to do that. Jessica, quit smiling. Other questions? Did I answer your question, Caesar? Very good. Other comments or questions?
Thank you. I have to go.
Very good. If there are no other questions, I thank you all very much, folks. Have a great day. Enjoy. If you need anything, you know where we're at. We'll be glad to answer anything that you have. Otherwise, everybody have a great day and enjoy. Be well.
Thank you.
Good job, Rick.